For most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person who avoids unnecessary interactions. I'm not rude, I'll say "excuse me" and hold the elevator door, but I rarely go out of my way to talk to strangers. Living in New York City, that's not exactly unusual. Everyone's busy, everyone's in a rush, and everyone has their personal bubble. It was a Monday evening in October when everything changed. I had just finished a long day at my job in advertising. The campaign we'd been working on for weeks had hit a snag, and I was feeling irritable and mentally drained. All I wanted was to get home, microwave some leftover pasta, and collapse onto my couch. The subway platform was packed as usual. I managed to squeeze onto the train, finding a spot to stand near one of the doors. The air was thick with a mix of too many people and not enough ventilation. I put in my earbuds, scrolled to my Unwind playlist, and tried to mentally check out for the ride. A few stops later, a commotion broke through the usual hum of the subway. A man, maybe in his mid-50s, stumbled onto the train. His clothes were worn but clean, and he carried a battered duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He looked around nervously, his eyes darting between the passengers. "Excuse me," he said, his voice loud enough to cut through the ambient noise. "I'm sorry to bother everyone, but I really need some help. I just got out of the hospital, and I'm trying to get to the shelter on 14th Street. I don't have money for the bus fare." Most people did what you'd expect. They avoided eye contact, shifted in their seats, or suddenly became deeply engrossed in their phones. I was no different. I stared at the advertisement for a new Broadway show plastered above the door, pretending not to hear him. The man continued, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. "Please, I don't need much. Just enough to get on the bus." A young woman sitting nearby finally broke the silence. "Here," she said, reaching into her bag and handing him a few dollars. "Thank you," the man said earnestly, his shoulders relaxing slightly. As the train jolted forward, he moved to the far end of the car and sat down. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He wasn't doing anything suspicious, just sitting there, staring at the floor, clutching his duffel bag like it held his entire life. I felt a pang of guilt. I had cash in my wallet. I could have easily given him something. But like so many others, I'd chosen to ignore him. At the next stop, the train jolted to a sudden halt. The lights flickered, and an announcement crackled over the intercom, "Attention passengers, we are being held momentarily due to a signal malfunction. Please stand by." The collective groan from the passengers was almost comical. Everyone was already irritable, and now we were stuck in a packed train car with no air circulation. After a few minutes, I noticed the man from earlier shift uncomfortably in his seat. His breathing seemed shallow, and he started muttering to himself. "Not again, not again," he whispered, clutching his chest. The young woman who had given him money noticed too. She leaned over and asked softly, "Are you okay?" I have anxiety," he said, his voice shaking. "Claustrophobia. This is bad. This is really bad." For a moment, no one moved. Then, almost instinctively, people started reacting. The young woman handed him a water bottle. An older man near the doors took out a paper fan and started waving it to circulate air. I hesitated, feeling torn. I didn't know what to do, but doing nothing didn't feel right anymore. I knelt down beside him. "Hey," I said gently. "What can we do to help?" His eyes darted to mine, wide and full of fear. I need to get off this train." I nodded. "Okay. As soon as it moves again, we'll get you off at the next stop." The train started moving a few minutes later, and when it pulled into the station, several of us helped the man off. The platform was less crowded than the train, and he immediately seemed calmer. "Thank you," he said, his voice steadier now. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't helped." "No problem," I said, feeling a strange mix of relief and regret. We stayed with him for a while, making sure he was okay. He told us his name was Marcus and that he'd been living on the streets for a few months after losing his job and apartment. The hospital visit he'd mentioned earlier was real. He'd been treated for a panic attack and discharged that morning. Before we parted ways, I handed him the cash I had in my wallet. It wasn't much, but it felt like the least I could do. "Take care of yourself, Marcus," I said. "I will," he replied, his voice filled with gratitude. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Marcus. I realized how quick I'd been to judge, to dismiss him as just another person asking for money. But he was a person with struggles and fears, just like anyone else. Since then, I've tried to be more mindful, more compassionate. It's not always easy to break out of the bubble we build around ourselves, but sometimes, all it takes is a moment of empathy to make a difference. Looking back, I'm grateful for that crowded train ride. It reminded me that we're all human, and sometimes, we just need someone to see us, to acknowledge us, and to offer a helping hand. Second story. When my grandfather passed away last year, it wasn't entirely unexpected. He'd been battling various health issues for a while, and at 89, he often joked about having lived long enough to see too much. Despite his humor, losing him hit me harder than I expected. Grandpa Joe had been the cornerstone of our family, a man whose hand seemed capable of fixing anything, whose stories could hold even the most restless grandchild in rapt attention. After his funeral, my family faced the monumental task of sorting through his belongings. Grandpa Joe had lived in the same house for over 50 years, and his garage-turned-workshop was legendary among our relatives. It was a place filled with ancient tools, unfinished projects, and a lifetime of memories. No one wanted to touch it. "David," my mom said one Saturday morning, handing me a set of keys, "why don't you take the lead on clearing out the workshop? You always loved spending time in there with him." I agreed, though the idea felt daunting. I'd spent countless afternoons in that workshop as a kid, watching Grandpa Joe repair old radios or craft wooden toys. The thought of dismantling it felt like erasing a part of him. The workshop smelled exactly as I remembered: sawdust, oil, and a faint hint of coffee. Dust blanketed every surface, and sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, highlighting the organized chaos that defined Grandpa's work style. As I started going through the shelves, I found little treasures that transported me back in time: a hand-carved chess set he'd made for my 10th birthday, the blueprint for a birdhouse we built together, a pocket knife he'd once given me when I begged to help with a real project. But it wasn't just nostalgia that filled the room. Among the boxes of screws and jars of mismatched nails, I stumbled upon something unexpected: a locked wooden chest tucked under one of the workbenches. I'd never seen it before, and curiosity got the better of me. The lock was old and rusted, and it only took a few minutes with a screwdriver to pry it open. Inside, I found a collection of letters, photographs, and a small black journal. The first letter I opened was addressed to my grandmother, dated 1974. The handwriting was unmistakably Grandpa Joe's, but the tone was one I'd never associated with him: apologetic, almost pleading. "I'm sorry I kept this from you for so long," it began. "I thought I was protecting you, protecting all of us, but now I'm not so sure. If you ever find this, I hope you can forgive me." My stomach tightened as I read on. The letter alluded to a decision Grandpa had made decades ago, something about a business partner and a betrayal. He didn't go into specifics, but the regret was palpable. The photographs added another layer of mystery. One showed Grandpa Joe standing beside a man I didn't recognize in what looked like a workshop similar to his own. Another showed the same man, but this time he was posing with a woman and a little girl. The journal was where things took a darker turn. It started innocuously enough: notes about various projects, sketches of tools he wanted to invent. But as I flipped through the pages, I found entries detailing a failed business venture he'd once mentioned in passing. Grandpa Joe had partnered with the man in the photo, a friend named Richard, to create a line of handcrafted furniture. According to the journal, things went sour when Richard accused Grandpa of stealing designs. Grandpa denied it, but their friendship crumbled, and Richard left town. What shocked me most was what came next: a note scribbled in the margins of one entry. If I hadn't told that lie, maybe Richard would still be here. Maybe his family wouldn't have had to leave. A lie? Grandpa Joe had built his reputation on honesty. What kind of lie could have destroyed not just a friendship, but an entire family's stability? Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with piecing together the story. I found more letters in the chest, some written to Richard, others unsent drafts addressed to no one in particular. They painted a picture of a man tormented by guilt but too proud, or too scared, to set the record straight. The final piece of the puzzle came in the form of a letter from Richard himself. It was postmarked 1981, nearly a decade after their fallout. "Joe, I've forgiven you for what happened, but forgiveness doesn't undo the damage. My wife never recovered from the stress of losing everything, and my daughter resents me for not fighting harder. I hope you can live with yourself, but I don't know if I can." Reading those words felt like a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe my grandfather was the man I'd idolized, but the evidence suggested he was also deeply flawed. When I told my mom what I'd found, she was shaken. "Dad always carried a lot of weight on his shoulders," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "But I never imagined it was this." We debated what to do with the letters and journal. Part of me felt they should remain private, buried with Grandpa Joe. But another part of me wondered if sharing the truth could bring closure, not just for our family, but maybe even for Richard's. In the end, I tracked down Richard's daughter. It wasn't easy, but after weeks of searching online and following up on leads, I found her living in a small town upstate. Her name was Ellen, and she was hesitant to speak with me at first. When I explained who I was and why I'd reached out, her demeanor softened. "My dad talked about Joe a lot before he passed," she said. "I always wondered if they ever made peace." I gave her copies of the letters and offered to return the photographs. We talked for hours about our fathers, their complicated friendship, and the ways their choices had shaped our lives. Ellen thanked me before I left. "It doesn't erase what happened," she said, "but it helps to know your grandfather regretted it. Maybe that's enough." Clearing out Grandpa Joe's workshop took months, but by the time I finished, it felt less like erasing him and more like understanding him. He wasn't perfect, none of us are, but he was human, and he tried to make things right in his own way. That chest and its contents reminded me of something profound: our pasts don't define us, but how we reckon with them does. Third story. I'd never planned to end up in Detroit that night. It was a spur-of-the-moment road trip, the kind that sounded better in theory than it played out in practice. My plan was simple: drive from Chicago to Toronto, take in the sights, and escape the monotony of my day-to-day routine. What I didn't plan for was the storm that turned the highways into rivers, or the detour that left me navigating unfamiliar streets in a city I'd only seen in movies and news reports. By the time I realized I'd made a wrong turn, it was too late. The rain was relentless, my GPS was glitching, and I was running on fumes, both in terms of my car's gas tank and my own energy. The neighborhood I found myself in looked rougher than I was comfortable with: boarded-up windows, graffiti-covered walls, and streets eerily devoid of people. I spotted a gas station up ahead, its flickering neon sign a small beacon in the downpour. Pulling in, I breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. The place looked as rundown as the surrounding area. A single pump stood beneath a sagging awning, and the convenience store was dimly lit, its windows barred. I hesitated, but decided I didn't have much choice. I needed gas, and I needed directions. As I stepped out of my car, the rain soaked through my jacket instantly. The pump was ancient, the kind where you had to pay inside first. I jogged toward the store, water sloshing in my sneakers. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew and something fried. The cashier was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a cigarette tucked behind his ear. He barely looked up as I approached the counter. "Pump one, $20, I said, handing him a soggy bill. He took it, his expression unreadable. "You're not from around here, are you?" "Nope," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just passing through." He nodded slowly, eyeing me in a way that made me feel exposed. "Be careful out there," he said, his tone more warning than friendly. As I filled up my tank, a car pulled into the station, its headlights slicing through the rain. It was an old sedan, the kind that looked like it had seen better decades. 2 men stepped out, both wearing hoodies, their faces obscured by the shadows. My pulse quickened. I told myself I was being paranoid, that not everyone in a hoodie was a threat. But something about their movements, slow, deliberate, set off alarm bells in my head. One of them approached me while the other lingered by their car. "Hey, man," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "You got $1 or two? My buddy and I are just trying to get home." "I don't, sorry," I lied, my hand tightening on the gas nozzle. He tilted his head, studying me. "You sure? Looks like you're doing all right for yourself." Before I could respond, a third voice cut through the rain. "Hey! Leave him alone." I turned to see an older woman standing in the doorway of the convenience store. She was small but wiry, her gray hair tied back in a ponytail. She held a mop in one hand, but the way she stood made it clear she wasn't afraid to use it as a weapon if necessary. The man muttered something under his breath and backed off, motioning for his friend to follow. They got into their car and drove off, the taillights disappearing into the rain. "Thanks," I said, my voice shaky. "Don't mention it," she replied, stepping back inside. I finished pumping my gas and debated whether to leave immediately or go back into the store to thank her properly. Something about her intervention felt significant, like I owed her more than a hurried thanks over my shoulder. Inside, she was wringing out the mop, her movements brisk but purposeful. "Hey," I said, approaching her. "I just wanted to say I appreciate what you did out there." She glanced up, her sharp blue eyes meeting mine. "This ain't the kind of place where you ignore someone in trouble," she said simply. We got to talking, and I learned her name was Margaret. She'd worked at the gas station for over 20 years, long enough to see the neighborhood decline and most of her regular customers move away. "You get used to looking out for people," she said. "Not everyone's bad around here, but you gotta know who to trust." I asked her why she stayed, why she didn't move somewhere safer. "This place is home," she replied. "And home ain't always perfect, but it's still yours." Our conversation stretched longer than I expected, and before I knew it, an hour had passed. Margaret told me stories about the neighborhood's heyday, about the people who used to fill the streets with laughter and music. When I finally left, the rain had eased to a drizzle. Margaret waved from the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the store. "Take care of yourself, kid," she called out. Driving away, I felt a strange mix of emotions. The fear and tension from earlier had faded, replaced by a sense of connection. Margaret's kindness had been unexpected, her courage humbling. That night, I checked into a cheap motel and lay awake thinking about her. I realized how quick I'd been to judge the neighborhood, to assume the worst of its people. Margaret's small act of bravery reminded me that humanity is complicated, full of both shadows and light. I never saw Margaret again, but her words stayed with me. Home ain't always perfect, but it's still yours. They made me think about my own life, about the places and people I took for granted. Sometimes, it takes a wrong turn to find the right perspective.